In my seemingly never-ending quest to try out every single synthesizer and effects pedal ever created by mankind, I've come across many a strange and magical beast, but none more unique and mysterious than this thing right here, the Make Noise Strega. I was always really drawn to the Strega, mainly because it seemed to be one of the more out there synthesizer designs I've seen in terms of functions and layout. Made in collaboration with Alessandro Cortini, the first thing that struck me as odd about this thing was the sheer lack of any identifiable standard labeling on the knobs, even by Make Noise's standards. This makes it perplexing to figure out at first, and presents an equally daunting challenge when trying to review and explain what it does to someone else. In this video, I want to share with you my wild journey exploring the Strega and its insane tonal capabilities, beyond the spec sheet, from a real user's perspective. If you're already a subscriber, huge welcome back. If this is your first time here though, hi, welcome to the Midlight Synthesist. Let's get started. I'll come absolutely clean here. My first few tries with the Strega were not pretty. Here's a taste of what my first patches on it sounded like. Please put away any dogs or cats near you before going forward. Suffice it to say, things were not looking good. I tweaked and toiled away at it, but I just couldn't get my head around this thing. In my despair, I thought to myself, what would Nick do? Undeterred, I decided to reread the manual when I finally came about my answer. I must have glossed over it the first time around, but hidden in plain sight on page 7 of its user manual were engraved these words. It is not important to fully understand the Strega itself. It is important to approach the Strega with a desire to experiment and an openness to results that may be outside of your control. I think that might be the best possible advice regarding playing and enjoying the Strega, as well as just great advice for facing life in general. I came back to the Strega with a new outlook, not that of an uncompromising totalitarian just trying to whip this thing to bend to my will. But as a student of what this device might teach me, and boy did that pay off. If you're enjoying this video, I would really appreciate it if you could take a second to click that like button and maybe even leave me a comment, because that tickles the algorithm in all the right places and helps this video not get buried in the shadow realm. Thanks a lot. At its core, there are two main sections to the Strega, an oscillator or sound source section, and a filter/delay section. Contrary to most semi-modulars I've seen out there, this thing does not have an amplitude envelope generator, which means once you turn up the level, it's basically always on. The manual suggests you start with everything turned counterclockwise, and you start slowly adjusting the level until you hear it comfortably, and then start playing around with the activation interference and the activation constant. But I would argue that that is not exactly the best entry point. At least not for me. I found an easier way into the Strega through its mellower side by turning up the level and then playing around with its tone knob first, with both the activation interference and constant all the way down to 0. By sweeping through the tones, you go from higher to lower pitches, but you also get a sort of wave folding, which can really make this monosynth sound huge. If you're feeling adventurous, you could start fiddling away with the activation. But I would suggest to hold off until you first get a taste of the filter and delay section. The delay is weird. There's no way around that. It's not your typical delay, and playing around with the delay knob will have huge tonal effects and even like explosion-like or metal bending type of sounds come out of it. The trick here is to remember that this is not your typical synth, so don't expect it to behave like one. It can be very musical if you hone in on the sweet spot, but I think that the cool thing about this is that it gives you a sound palette that you don't usually get somewhere else. Also input external sound sources or route the audio of the Strega back into itself and use the Strega as a sort of effects pedal. If you're relatively new to modular or semi-modular synths in general, there are two important things that I should point out in case you're considering this as your first venture into the rabbit hole that is Eurorack. The Strega does not have MIDI in. That means that unlike the Okos, where you can use MIDI in with a CV converter, here you have to use conventional CV to control the pitch. So you need to have either other modular gear or a MIDI controller with CV outputs like the Oxy One, the Deluge, or the Keystep 37 if you want to sequence its pitch. The second, as I mentioned earlier, is that the Strega does not have an amplitude envelope generator. This means that you can set the level of volume, but you won't have an attack, sustain, and release as you would in other semi-modular synths, unless you put it through something with an amplitude envelope generator, like the Pro 3 that I'm using right here. The Strega does have a filter and an envelope for that filter, but that envelope is more of an LFO, and you have three basic shapes which you could sweep around, but it doesn't require a trigger to activate it. The Strega was built for knob twiddlers and sound noodlers, and that intent is written all over its front panel. You even have some patch points that require you to connect the dots with your own fingers, though Heinbach does like to use vegetables. This is pretty much as hands-on as it can get. As a side note, I found it kind of funny that one of the tones that I can generate on this thing is the same sound that a disgruntled sugar glider makes when you try to wake it up. And that for me is the killer app of the Strega. Its tones. The Strega delivers a huge piece of the sound palette that was missing from my setup. I'm talking about end-of-the-earth Armageddon sound effects here. It's not always pretty, mind you, and I'd argue that that's the whole point of this device. Art and music shouldn't always be beautiful in the traditional sense. There really is something there in between the shrill cries of banshees you can conjure up and the sweet whisper of its purest tones that's just... it's sublime to be able to be in control of that. The Strega is certainly not for the faint of heart, but if you're looking for a synth that can take you to heaven and then take you way down to hell without batting an eye, definitely take this bad boy out for a spin. As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video useful, or at least entertaining. Have a great week. See you next time.